Day 2 of evolution notes. So yesterday we looked at Darwin and Lamarck and talked about the theories of evolution. And we said Lamarck was kind of disproven by Darwin, who said that natural selection occurs and nature selects the traits that are favorable and they get passed on generation. Eventually, after thousands, if not millions of years, new populations or new species are able to form. So today we want to look at some evidence of evolution. How do we know that evolution occurs? And we're going to look at it from a scientific point of view. So it kind of goes into 4 categories, and I wrote them at the top for you guys right here. So we're looking at fossils, and I didn't really do too many slides. I didn't do any slides on fossils here for you. You guys know what fossils are. So an organism dies, it gets buried under the ground, and we can dig up those bones a little bit later on. And scientists can go through and actually date them to see how old those particular bones are. They can do radioactive dating with radioactive carbon, or they can do absolute dating, meaning how far down layer-wise is that particular fossil. But your radioactive carbon is going to be a little bit more thorough and give you a better exact date of that. So we can see, you know, these organisms were around the same time, maybe they're kind of related. We can look at the bone structures of those fossils and look at some evolution with that. We want to look more at body structures, embryo similarities, as well as biochemistry. Those are the other 3 of the 4 of those evidences of evolution. So we're going to start off with comparative anatomy. We're looking at body structures. So the first one, meaning we're going to look at likeness of anatomy, and that is known as homologous structures. So we talked about the word homo before. Homo means the same. So if we're talking about homologous structures, think about different organisms. Let's think about a whale, a cat, a bat, and a gorilla. And what you're looking at here is kind of that front appendage on them. So a fin, a front flipper on the whale, front leg of a cat, wing of a bat, and the arm of a gorilla. If we think about them, we can look at these homologous structures. All 4 of these organisms, even though they're really not what we consider related, they all have the same bone structure to them. So we can look at the forearms, we can look at all the little finger bones that we have here, and they all have the same bone structure within them. However, each of them is going to use these particular structures to go through and do a different function. So we're talking similar structure, different function is what you guys will see here. So whether we use it to swim, walk, fly, grab onto things. So each organism has kind of adapted to a different function. So homologous, same bone structure, different function. And what it's basically showing us is that millions of years ago, these organisms evolved from a common ancestor. They all have the same bone structure in them. So if we trace them back through that phylogenetic tree back to thousands, millions of years ago, could they have come from or evolved from the same type of organism? And over time, those variations in bone structure allows them to survive better for what they're doing, and they form new species. The next little one that we have is something else we kind of talked about throughout the year. It's known as vestigial structures. Vestigial structures are organs with no function in one organism that are similar in function organs of other organisms, meaning we have parts of our body that we still have that play no role whatsoever that other organisms may have and they actually still use. So humans, for instance, have tailbones. The very end of your spine, you have that little coccyx bone at the very, very tip of it. So if anybody's ever kind of fallen on their butt and broken that little piece, you know that you have a tailbone there. But what we're saying is, did we evolve from organisms that possibly had tails? And they kind of still use those particular parts. And it's a good variation for them where we don't really need them. The appendix is another one. So the very end of your large intestine, you guys have a little piece called your appendix. So your appendix is thought to be a vestigial structure, meaning it has no function. But who's not to say thousands, if not millions of years ago, our diets were a little bit different. Maybe we had to eat more of plant material or bark or things like that that required us to help break it down just a little bit more. And we needed that appendix to do that. So there are still some organisms that utilize that. Muscles that make your ears move. So if you have a cat at home, that cat can kind of, without turning its head, turn those ears around. Or if you've ever seen a deer outside, they can kind of just stand still, but those ears will kind of turn so they're picking up all the different sounds. We can't sit there and turn our ears or twitch our ears back and forth. Snakes, they actually have little hip bones. Whales actually have little hip bones to them. They don't have legs anymore, but did they evolve from organisms that had legs? So they still have the bones. If you x-ray them, you can actually see hip bones within them. And that's what vestigial structures are. Just to make a little side note about your appendix, studies are now coming out saying that, you know what, we think of this appendix as a vestigial structure, but they're kind of seeing that it kind of houses a lot of different bacteria that play a role within our immune system as well. So they're saying, oh, you know what, maybe it doesn't have a function, but maybe now it has a different function than what it originally had in the beginning. Analogous structures. So analogous structures, I kind of think of as like the opposite of homologous structures. So let's think about it this way. Different in structure, but similar in function. So let's think, bat wing, butterfly wing, bird wing. They all have wings. They all use them to fly, but structurally they're a little bit different. Where here, structurally they're kind of the same, but they have different function. Here we have the same function, but different structure. So whether it's kind of like some skin, whether it's a couple cells thick, your bird's got some feathers and bones to it, they're all going to use them to fly, but they're all made up a little bit differently. So that's our analogous structures there. So a little bit different than homologous. So those are all different body structures that we have. As we move on, the next little bit of evidence of evolution is embryological similarities. So as we're forming within womb, a lot of different organisms are going to be very relatable. You can almost not tell the difference between them. So if you look at these particular embryos that are forming, the first one is what is known as a lamprey. A lamprey is just a jawless fish. Second one is a turtle. You have a chicken, you have a cat, and yep, you got your human there. So if I was asked you to kind of pick out one of them as a human, you probably wouldn't be able to do that. You could probably go, oh, well, that's probably not it, and probably not that one. But as you get through here, they look a little bit more similar. So what we're looking at here is, though, as you are forming an embryo, it's hard to tell the difference. We all have little tails that they will kind of disappear. We have gill slits. Even the humans will have gill slits that will disappear. We all have two-chambered hearts that will eventually form into four. We all are notochords and backbones. So they're saying that the more similarities between them as they're forming an embryo, could they have evolved from more of a similar organism? So we could say, oh, this human probably evolved from kind of the same organism as this cat or this chicken, but not as much. It's not as related to the lamprey or the turtle. And we can kind of create a phylogenetic tree to see who evolved where and maybe from what organisms. So we can say that they are definitely more relatable than the two on the end here. Biochemistry, and what I mean by that is like your amino acid sequences, your proteins. Think back, it relates to your DNA because your DNA codes for your messenger RNA and your messenger RNA codes for your amino acids, and we put those amino acids together and we make proteins. We talked about that with our protein synthesis section. So we can look at these amino acid sequences. We can pull DNA out of these organisms, say, hey, let's look at this amino acid sequences. Hey, it's pretty similar between this organism and this organism. Well, maybe they evolved from similar organisms. The more closely related they are in terms of amino acid sequences, maybe they evolved a little bit sooner than other organisms. So the one that they're looking at here is what is known as cytochrome C. So cytochrome C is a protein within our bodies that's going to help to transport oxygen. So it's kind of like hemoglobin, but a slightly different protein. So by looking at the proteins, we can then look at the amino acid sequences, we can look at the DNA code. The more in common in terms of that DNA code, the more closely related organisms are. So if we're looking at this little diagram that you guys see here, let me blow it up a little bit for you. And we're looking at some. So you have a human, you have pig, you have duck, snake, tuna, moth, and then way over here you got yeast, which is a fungi. And we're looking at cytochrome C. And we're going, okay, well, if we look at that particular protein, we're looking at your nucleotide base pairs that make up that particular protein. Oh, humans and pigs, they only have 13 differences. Humans and ducks have 17. Human and snake have 20. So we can actually say, oh, here's our phylogenetic tree. Maybe this organism is where these particular organisms evolved from. Well, as we go up, we can say whatever organism was here kind of evolved into these particular ones. Well, maybe here our snake, duck, pig, and human evolved from an organism we could find right at this little piece where tuna and moth evolved out a little bit earlier on. Way up here, we can say, oh, you know, maybe a couple million years ago, billion years ago, human and pig evolved from a common ancestor that we found right here. How can we say that? Well, our amino acid sequences are pretty similar for certain parts of our DNA. Yeast, way off, completely different kingdom. We see it way over here. And we can say, well, maybe it evolved from an organism way back here. So we can still use that as an evidence of evolution and how things evolved and changed, and where organisms basically arose from. And that's a good example of your little phylogenetic tree that you guys see there. So now that we have our evidences of evolution, we can actually utilize them to look at our types of evolution. So types of evolution, what we mean by that is what is known as divergent and convergent evolution. So we have these evidences. Let's look at trends. Where did organisms come from? How do these populations change and create these new species? So when you think of something that diverges, it's kind of moving away from each other. And that's just what's happening here in this divergent evolution. We're talking about a group from a population develops into a new species. And it's probably because the environment which they're living in, those favorable traits survive better in that environment. And the best example for this, Darwin's finches. So we said Darwin's finches on Galapagos Island, we had one type of finch, and as those islands began to spread, we eventually formed all these different finches here based on their particular beaks. They diverged from this original finch species, and they fit the island in which they were living on. They survived best on that island. So whether they had to break down large seeds or get little seeds or maybe eat insects out of the bark or whatever it is, they survived best. That's what their variation said to them. So they all have homologous structures. Similar structure, different function. What are they using that beak for? Are they breaking down things? Are they digging in things? So similar structure, same structure. They all have beaks, but they're using them for different functions. Another example you can look up is a red fox and a kid fox. Divergent evolution. They were once one species. They were once the same species, and something happened where they kind of got divided and they had to survive in the areas in which they were. So those favorable traits are the ones that survived. And after millions of years, we now have two different species of fox. So we're diverging from a common ancestor, which we see here with the finches, and we're forming many new species. If we go the opposite way and we talk about convergent, converge, coming closer together. So we can actually look at organisms and see how they come closer together. How do they have similar traits? So we're divergent evolution, we're looking at more of homologous structures. Convergent evolution, we're looking more at analogous structures, meaning they have similar traits, but they're really not similar organisms that we see here. So these analogous structures show that although unrelated, some organisms will adapt in the same way to an environment. They're going to converge, they're going to come together on that adaptation. So let's think about a shark, a penguin, and a porpoise. They all live in water. One's a bird, one's a fish, one's a mammal though. So they're completely different organisms. They all have analogous structures. Those analogous structures, they have streamlined bodies that allow them to swim faster. Even though they are completely different organisms, they are coming together. They're living in the same environment. They have these streamlined bodies. Natural selection causes unrelated species to appear similar. So when you see them swim through the water and how they glide through the water with these streamlined bodies, it makes them look like they are kind of similar organisms and they have these similar traits to them. So once again, divergent evolution, we're looking more at homologous structures. Convergent evolution, we're looking more at analogous structures. Completely different organisms, but they're kind of, because they all have these streamlined bodies, just like that bird and butterfly all have wings, they all use them to fly, but they're completely different organisms. Same thing with your shark, your penguin, and your porpoise. Completely different organisms. However, these streamlined bodies make them appear that they are very similar in terms of the particular organisms. A third one that I don't have a slide of is known as coevolution. We talked about it with meiosis with plants and flowers and how we need bees and hummingbirds and organisms need to kind of survive together. And that's what coevolution is. Two organisms evolve together and are dependent upon each other. So as flowers evolve, they smell better, they attract more organisms. Maybe the stamen and the pistil maybe gets a little bit longer. Birds also have to adapt to that. They have to maybe grow longer, not really grow longer beaks, but that variation of having a longer beak is favorable and they're the ones that are going to survive. So over time, as flowers evolve, the organism that basically helps to transfer the pollen is going to evolve. So whether it's bees or whether it's birds, and over time, thousands of years, you might start to see hummingbirds with longer and longer beaks because they need to get into that flower in order to feed on it and at the same time get that particular pollen. Flowers are evolving. They're smelling better. They're more brightly colored. They're attracting organisms to them because they want to go through and get their pollen spread so that they're able to reproduce and produce the next generation. Last little bit that I want to look at today, and you guys will have a couple little videos that you'll be looking at with this as well, so a couple little ed puzzles, is the rate of evolution. So even though there was an argument over what evolution was and how things evolved, there's also one on how quickly it evolves. So two scientists, we already talked about Darwin. The other one is Eldridge and Gould, two scientists that talked about punctuated equilibrium. So what they said is that, okay, here's a little species, and species are going to stay constant, they're going to stay the same for a long period of time, and something's going to happen. Something in the environment's going to happen, and it's going to force them to basically change. So where we see this punctuated equilibrium is more or less in small populations. So if I have a small population, and let's say an earthquake or a flood or something happens, and we're limiting that gene pool, it's easier to see these variations kind of change a little bit more quickly. So this punctuated equilibrium, where things stay the same for long periods of time, something happens in the environment and it kind of forces those organisms. It lowers the gene pool so we don't have as much variation. So those ones that have the good variations are going to survive, and it's going to pass it on a little bit quicker there. And we're going to see more of that population have the variation in the next generation. Why? The population wasn't large to begin with. Darwin, on the other hand, talks about gradualism. And we said we're building up these little accumulations of variations along the way, generation to generation to generation. So it's a slow, steady pace that you see here. You may not see these changes from one generation to the next, but if we look back over millions of years, you're going to see that evolution does occur, and that this gradualism basically talks about changes that gradually occur over time. So we just talked about punctuated equilibrium. We said, okay, well, something's going to happen. Or gradualism, we're going to start to see new species. Well, what causes this new species? What's going to create this new species? So there's a bunch of things that can happen. So the first one could be a geographic isolation. And this is kind of what happened with Darwin's finches. One main cause of speciation, meaning a new species forms. A group of the same species gets separated. So Galapagos Islands starts splitting apart and the birds can't fly back and forth to the islands. Or maybe there is an earthquake and it forms like this canyon between this population of chipmunks or whatever those organisms may be. And they can't come back together again. So the individuals that are most fit for the new environment, maybe one side's a little bit colder than the other, they're the ones that are going to survive. Many generations later, because variations are causing them to be a little bit different from each other, and each favorable variation gets passed on and on and on, eventually they're going to be a little different from each other. So many generations later, even if they do come back together, they're no longer able to interbreed. So we kind of have this reproductive isolation that's occurred. Members of what used to be the same species, they can't interbreed anymore because they're a little bit different from each other. Variations got passed on, favorable variations survive, and they start to become different species. Second way, environmental disaster. A new predator gets put into the ecosystem. We talked about the Florida Everglades with the python. Someone, let a python or two, and they are overwhelmed with them right now. Organisms need to change. So the little chipmunks that may live there, or rabbits that may live there, or birds that may live there, they need to kind of change too. Favorable variations are going to survive better, and these populations are going to change. So maybe they're a little faster, or they can camouflage a little bit better. Pollution will do it. Chernobyl, which was the disaster over in Russia way before you guys were born, but radioactivity within the ecosystem, and it's changing organisms there. Maybe it's a hurricane, maybe it's a flood. All of these, besides geographic, we also have environmental disasters. So what happens? The groups are no longer in the same species. They diverge from each other. Go back to Darwin's finches. They started as 13 different ones. If they come back together, those finches cannot reproduce together. Same with these guys. Gully, canyon, flood, water separates these two guys. If they come back together again, they can no longer interbreed. Divergent evolution. What does this do? It reduces the gene pool. And the gene pool just means all the genes in a population. If I have a large population, think about just our class of students. Think about the genes that are there. Eye color, hair color, whether you have freckles, this or that. Kind of a small gene pool because it's a lower number of students. If we take the gene pool of everybody within our school, it's a much larger gene pool, probably a lot more genes, a lot more variation, because we have a larger population. And that's what happens when we split these particular populations up. So if a population lacks diversity, meaning we don't have as many variations, there's a good possibility that it can die out. And that's what we're going to look at a little bit more tomorrow. We're going to talk about genetics with evolution and gene pools, and some different things that can cause this to happen. And we'll look at small populations, even within our country, such as Amish or Mennonites. There are smaller populations that only kind of live within those particular populations. And what happens if something comes in and can kind of destroy that? Do they have enough of the genes within that gene pool in order to allow them to survive? Okay, so we'll continue that a little bit more tomorrow. We probably have one more day of notes, and we'll be finishing up some stuff and probably a test sometime before the end of next week is what I'm hoping for, so we can get a little bit of stuff in with your dissections. Let me know if you guys have questions. Otherwise, we're going to keep moving on, and we'll talk tomorrow. Thanks, bye.